All right, so let's talk about the continuation of Cold War policies during Eisenhower's administration. So, first off, we should take a look at this gentleman here. His name was John Foster Dulles. He was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. Um, what we find is that by the time we get to Eisenhower's presidency, there is a greater reliance on nuclear superiority over more conventional military forces, like traditional ground troops. So this is major because we're going to see a dramatic shift away from sort of more of a traditional army under massive retaliation. And in a lot of ways, this makes us ill-equipped to deal with some of the smaller brushfire conflicts that we experience in this stage of the Cold War. So John Foster Dulles took the anti-communism policy a little bit farther, in the sense that beyond containment, which we discussed under Truman's presidency, Dulles wanted to actually roll back communism even further. So, I mean, they essentially wanted the communist influence to be no greater than where it was by 1945. There's also a push for brinkmanship, which in other words is kind of edging communist powers all the way to the brink of war until they would back down due to American nuclear superiority. So essentially the idea was that you'd build up so many nuclear weapons that shared fear you had would prevent you from ever using them. We're going to see, though, that Dwight Eisenhower does prevent Dulles from carrying all of his foreign policy ideas to the extreme, because as we remember, Eisenhower was moderate in many ways. But still, we do see, to a certain extent, a greater emphasis on nuclear weapons during Eisenhower's presidency. So the policy of massive retaliation we can also associate with Dulles. What he wanted to do was place greater reliance on nuclear weapons and air power and not spending as much money on conventional forces. Right, so this also very much goes along with the new look of his foreign policy. The idea behind massive retaliation was that you would get more bang for your buck. So in other words, it cost a lot more for you to actually send troops somewhere. It cost a lot less to build up nuclear weapons. This is very much going to contribute to the arms race that results between the U.S. and the USSR. We're going to see that by 1953, both the U.S. and the USSR have developed their own hydrogen bomb, which is drastically stronger than the atomic bomb that was used on Japan. So we're going to see that massive retaliation may be effective in terms of keeping the U.S. and USSR from going to war with one another. But what it does not prevent is smaller conflicts from rising up in other regions. And the U.S. is no longer able to respond to those effectively when they don't have as many ground troops. The first major example of that is the 1956 Hungarian Uprising, where the Soviet Union sent tanks into the capital of Budapest, and the U.S. was not able to effectively help Hungary. So Stalin dies in 1953, and in many ways it seems like this could be an opportunity for a thaw in the Cold War relationship between the U.S. and the USSR. The new premier of the Soviet Union is Nikita Khrushchev. We see him here shaking hands with Eisenhower. The idea was that Khrushchev started to move away from Stalin's extremism. First off, Khrushchev actually in 1956 gives a speech called the Secret Speech, where he denounced Stalin's crimes. And he also argued that there should be a sense of a peaceful coexistence with the West. So in other words, Khrushchev supported more of the idea that the two empires could have very different structured economies and politics, but it didn't mean that they had to sort of develop these tense relationships that caused them to build up nuclear weapons. The two of them are going to meet in the Geneva summit in Switzerland, and this is where Eisenhower proposes Khrushchev with an open skies policy, which would mean that both of the countries would be able to fly over one another, and they could photograph the regions. And so the idea was for them to sort of eliminate the chance of a nuclear attack by monitoring, what's actually going on the other side. Now, Khrushchev does actually reject the Open Skies Treaty, but what's significant about it still is that these two men were actually willing to talk and negotiate. And this seemed like a pretty far cry from the tension that we saw between Stalin and Truman and Eisenhower. So basically, it seems like there's at least a possibility for the East and West to work together when Khrushchev takes over the Soviet Union. So it seems like there are steps towards more peaceful coexistence, but again, the Open Skies Treaty is eventually violated with the U-2 incident, so we're going to see that peaceful coexistence is temporary. As I mentioned earlier, there was an uprising in Hungary in 1956. Basically, these people who were under communist rule start to revolt against the Soviet presence. They destroy Soviet statues that were built up in their cities. And the Soviet Union ends up sending tanks into major cities. Like this is a picture of tanks in Budapest. And Hungary reaches out to Eisenhower's administration for help. But he actually refuses to intervene, partly because massive retaliation prevents him from actually having the manpower to do so. So in a way, it seemed like the U.S. was tacitly recognizing the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. This also shows us, the fact that the Soviets are suppressing, sort of a sense of self-rule in Hungary. This ends the first thaw in the Cold War in many ways. So continuing on, in 1956, or 7 rather, Sputnik is launched by the Soviet Union. This was an unmanned satellite that went into our orbit around the Earth. And this is significant because this shows us that the Soviet Union was the first country to actually launch this unmanned spacecraft. So it makes the United States feel like they're lagging behind in terms of scientific development. So they sort of freak out, and this triggers the space race, which was sort of like the arms race. The idea was for each country to outdo each other in terms of its production. And so the U.S. Helps trigger the space race by spending additional money on education. So the National Defense and Education Act is passed, and what this does is increase funding in education, specifically in terms of science and math. And also in 1958, NASA was founded. So you have this new agency of the federal government that's aim is to build missiles and also explore outer space. And of course, as we know, when Kennedy becomes president, he makes a promise that the U.S. is going to land a man on the moon, which does not happen in Kennedy's lifetime, but does happen by the end of the 1960s. We also have another Berlin crisis. I guess one could say the first Berlin crisis was the Berlin blockade, which we've already discussed. Now, what happens here is that Khrushchev is going to give the West a 6-month ultimatum to pull troops out of West Britain. So again, he's saying that there should be no Western presence in Berlin. He gives a speech where he says, we will bury you, or we will bury capitalism. Essentially what he meant by that was that it was inevitable that communism was going to take over that region. So again, he gives the West a 6-month ultimatum to try to push out, but the U.S. refuses to do so. And in order to try to ease the tension with the Soviet Union, Eisenhower invites Khrushchev to visit Camp David, which is the U.S. presidential retreat. The fact that they have this negotiation, here's a picture of the two of them meeting here, shows us again this sense of, at least the willingness to work together, which is very similar to the spirit of Geneva, which we already discussed, right? So the spirit of Camp David is what results from this Camp David discussion, and ultimately this spirit is not particularly long-lasting in that the U-2 incident in 1959 is going to cause, again, the relationship to tense up between the U.S. and the USSR. So let's talk about Eisenhower's policy in terms of basically whether or not to use direct troop presence or be a little bit more subtle. Eisenhower used the CIA very liberally in his policy of covert action. So essentially what we're seeing on the one hand, after World War II, we start to see an increasing movement towards decolonization of all the countries in the developing world that were subject to imperial rule before World War I and also after World War I. So this decolonization period is going to cause Eisenhower in particular to try to prevent these countries from becoming communist, right? Both of these countries are going to sort of spark the interest of the US and USSR that want to have increasing influence over them. So between 1947 and 1962, dozens of former colonies in Africa and Asia gained their independence from former colonial powers. So for example, India and Pakistan become new countries in 1947. Ghana throws off British rule in 1957. And like I was saying before, these new third world countries often lacked stable political and economic institutions. So they need foreign aid in order to continue to develop. And this foreign aid is likely going to come from either the US or the USSR. And so essentially these countries, even if they want to remain non-aligned, are going to become pawns of the Cold War. As I said earlier, Eisenhower is going to use the CIA to sponsor paramilitary operations in the Third World. So basically he's trying to get these countries to recover resources from foreign investors, right? This is much less objectionable and less expensive than the U.S. Employing troops. So you can think of covert action as another shift in foreign policy, just like massive retaliation. We're going to see also that the U.S. has an increasing role in the Middle East. This is articulated by the Eisenhower Doctrine, which essentially says that the U.S. now has the ability to intervene in the Middle East in order to stop the spread of communism. Now, first, there are going to be American CIA interventions in Iran. They overthrow the government and they help secure oil concessions in the process. So there's going to be a new Shah of Iran who was in a more favorable relationship with the U.S. because of this overthrow. And so he grants the West with favorable oil prices and makes enormous purchases of U.S. arms. So one thing that's interesting is we're going to see that once we get into this time period, that there's a really, complicated and problematic relationship between with the U.S. in terms of how it wants to have a relationship with Arab countries because of its access to oil and the newly established state of Israel. The Suez Crisis shows us, again, an example of the U.S. intervening in the Middle East. So what we see is, like I was saying, the U.S. is kind of trying to balance its friendly relations with both the oil-rich Arab states and also supporting the new state of Israel. So Egypt tries to ask the U.S. for funds to build the Aswan Dam project on the Nile River. But the U.S. refuses because they see that Egypt is actually a threat to Israel's security, and they definitely want to seem like they're more pro-Israel. Nasser, the president of Egypt, decides then to turn to the Soviet Union to get help to build the Aswan Dam. So when they do this, they also decide to seize and nationalize the Suez Canal, and this was something that was controlled by Britain and France up until this point. So this is really threatening to Britain and France because the Suez Canal, up until this point, really gave Western countries a supply line to Middle Eastern oil. So Britain, France, and Israel decide to launch a surprise attack against Egypt and take back the Suez Canal. Now, Eisenhower is furious that this happens because he's kept in the dark about this attack, and this was conducted by his old allies. So Eisenhower actually sponsors a UN resolution to condemn the British, French, and Israeli invasion of Egypt, and these countries that invade actually decide to withdraw from Egypt because of public pressure. Now, because of his success in this, Eisenhower articulates the Eisenhower Doctrine, which again is where the U.S. replaced Britain and France as the leading Western influence in the Middle East. So a lot of this is because the loss of prestige of England and France after World War II created a power vacuum in the Middle East, and the U.S. wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from having any influence over it. So in Eisenhower's Doctrine, he pledges economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country that was threatened by communism. And in 1958, we see him enforcing the Eisenhower Doctrine by sending 14,000 Marines into Lebanon to prevent a civil war between Christians and Muslims. And lastly, OPEC, which was the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This was a combination of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and Venezuela, who formed together. And we're going to find that the growing conflict between Israel and Palestine is definitely going to lead to trouble with U.S. policy in the Middle East, because they still continue to depend on oil, but they want to maintain this relationship with Israel. So we're going to see that that is certainly leading to more tension in the future. And I just hope that you pay attention, maybe pause for a second, but just to pay attention to the similarities between Eisenhower and Truman's administrations. In a lot of ways, we get to see that Eisenhower's foreign policy is a continuation of what Truman established. All right, so let's take a break here, and we'll pick up with the Guatemalan coup, and then we'll also talk about Cold War policies in Asia.